Okay, so it seems we have all of the panelists connected, and we have quite a few participants already online. So just to welcome everyone, bienvenidos a todos. As we discussed with Pascal, I think that perhaps we can already get started. So I would like to give you the floor, Pascal. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And on behalf of FAO and the Secretariat of the World Banana Forum, it's my pleasure to welcome the members of the World Banana Forum and its Task Force on Gender Equity, and also to welcome all participants to today's webinar. This webinar will focus on the launch of the World Banana Forum guidelines on a healthy and safe employment of women workers in the Latin American banana industry, which were very recently published. Before we start the meeting, I will just briefly read some basic housekeeping rules. As you can see, also you have them on the screen. So please turn off your microphone when you're not speaking. You will see that interpretation is available in English and Spanish. You need to click on the little globe at the bottom of the screen where you see the globe and interpretation written. So you can choose your channel, Spanish or English. So the meeting is recorded, but only for internal reporting purposes. So we won't quote you. It's just to help us prepare the report after the meeting. And remember also to raise your hand to speak or to pose questions using the chat box. Or if you have questions or comments or inputs, feel free to use the chat box also. Also remember not to speak too fast also, because we have the interpreters in order to help them do their job. Try to speak more slowly. So with this, I think we have now most participants. I see that we have 50 participants so far. So that's good. So I will continue with the welcome. So as I think many members of the task force and many participants today know, the health and safety of women workers has been a priority topic of the Task Force on Gender Equity ever since its creation in 2012, following the first international meeting on gender equity held in Guayaquil under the World Banana Forum in February of that year. It was highlighted as a key area of concern also during the international meeting on gender equity, which took place together with the third global conference of the World Banana Forum in 2017 in Geneva. So these gender guidelines, we will be launched today, were developed to address specific health and safety concerns for women workers in the banana industry. And they aim to complement the Manual on Occupational Health and Safety for the banana industry that was produced under the Banana Occupational Health and Safety Initiative of the World Banana Forum, which is also known as the BOHESI initiative by its acronym. The BOHESI manual was first developed in Ecuador between 2014 and 2018, and it was later adapted to local contexts in Cameroon and in Ghana. So these gender guidelines were first produced under BOHESI activities in Ghana, led by Banana Link, which is present today. Banana Link is a founding member of the WBF, and this topic was presented in a webinar of the Gender Equity Task Force in July 2020, so already some time ago. Following the publication of these gender guidelines for Ghana, stakeholders in Latin America expressed the need for similar guidelines for the Latin American context. So in order to take into account the specific needs of women workers in Latin America and to consider the regional context, FAO and the WBF commissioned the adaptation of these guidelines in late 2020 through a letter of agreement with Banana Link. So this activity of producing similar guidelines for the Latin American context, adapting the Ghanaian guidelines to Latin America, required an extensive review process, and that was done with an expert in occupational health and safety, to ensure technical improvements to the document related to gender-sensitive health and safety risk assessment and to risk management. It also involved the work of a sociologist to ensure the proper adaptation of the contents to the Latin American context, and to the Latin American legislative frameworks. In addition to these reviews, interviews were conducted with women leaders of COLSIBA, the coordinating body of Latin American banana and agro-industrial unions, to better understand the hazards and risks faced by women workers in the main banana exporting countries in Latin America, and to identify measures that can be taken to mitigate these risks. Ultimately, these guidelines aim to contribute to an improvement in the working conditions of women in the Latin American banana industry, which, as we know, is an industry that has been historically dominated by men. The guidelines highlight the health and safety hazards and risks faced by all women workers in the industry, including also as a result of women-specific biological processes. The guidelines outline the necessary steps for conducting gender-sensitive risk assessments and also for implementing risk control measures to ensure a safe and healthy work environment for women workers. So today's session will count on important contributions from the key actors involved in the adaptation of the guidelines to Latin America, including COLSIBA, Banana Link, Peter Hurst, occupational health and safety expert who has played a key role in the revision of these guidelines, and the World Banana Forum Secretariat. These actors will discuss the document and its use in details. So now I will briefly go to the agenda. If we can have the agenda on the screen, please. So you'll see there will be first a session on background and overview of the guidelines, which will be presented by Anna Cooper from Banana Link and Camila from the WBF Secretariat. Then we will discuss insights on the health and safety of women workers in Latin America, representation by Adela Torres from COLSIBA, and then integrating the guidelines into gender-sensitive health and safety risk assessment and management. This session will be presented by Peter Hurst, occupational health and safety expert. And then we will open the floor to the public for discussion, and we'll have the closing remarks close around 5 to 6 by the World Banana Forum Secretariat. So having said this, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all the organizations involved in making this publication possible, including Banana Link, COLSIBA, also Peter Hurst as an expert, and the World Banana Forum Secretariat. Also, I'd like to thank all the participants for their participation today, and I hope that you will find the documents and the presentations useful. We also encourage you to participate actively in the discussions and to raise any questions that you may have during the webinar, raising your virtual hand or using the chat box as you prefer. Thank you for your attention and have a great and fruitful session. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Pascal, for the welcome on behalf of the Secretariat. So as we see on the agenda, the next point will be to discuss the background and overview of the guidelines in a bit more detail. So I would first like to give the floor to Anna to take the lead on this section. Anna, please, you have the floor.
Great, thanks, Camila, and thanks for the introduction, Pascal. So yeah, great to see so many of you here with us today to formally launch the guidelines on the healthy and safe employment of women in the Latin American banana industry. As mentioned by Pascal, my colleagues Camila, Peter and Adela are going to give a bit more specific information about the content of the guidelines and the specific health and safety issues for women in the Latin American banana industry. But we just felt that before we launch into that, it would be good to give a bit of background to the origins of the guidelines and a bit of information on how they were developed in the first context in Ghana. So thanks, Camila. So yeah, as mentioned by Pascal and as most of you have participated and helped us advance on this Over the last few years, health and safety and gender have really been at the core of our activities for a long time now, since the outset of the forum in 2019. And this work really has been advanced, in particular since the start of the BOHESI project and its activities in Ecuador and Cameroon. From the outset, we were aware, of course, of the need to incorporate gender-specific issues into the original activities of the BOHESI project. And we did make some progress on that at the time, but there really was need for us to gather further expertise on this issue. So it was a real opportunity for us to get together in 2017 for the World Banana Forum multi-stakeholder meeting on gender equity in the banana industry. And this was the first real opportunity that we had to fully assess the progress and the advances that had been made on health and safety and gender within the framework of the forum. A working group discussion was held and facilitated by Banana Link, the IUF, the ILO and COLSIBA. And we really identified the need to advance further on this issue, and in particular to develop gender-specific guidelines to accompany the existing resources that had come out of the BOHESI project. So luckily we weren't starting from zero on this. There was already a real wealth of existing resources available, particularly from the ILO on gender sensitive health and safety practices and risk assessments, and from the IUF on making women visible in occupational health and safety. And of course, lots of other resources from international or local trade unions and other actors within the industry. So we did, however, identify a need to really develop something that was specific not only to agriculture, but more specifically to the banana industry, to help us better educate and empower banana industry actors to make change at plantation level. So at the time, in addition to the BOHESI activities that were going on in Ecuador and Cameroon, we were able to secure some further funding from IDH to support a similar initiative in Ghana. This coincided with the launch of the Ghanaian Banana Producers Association in 2019, and they committed to co-fund the BOHESI activities in Ghana. And collaborate with local stakeholders, local trade unions on their implementation. So we were therefore able to make the most of this local capacity, to work with the industry in Ghana, to carry out field research, to identify the main occupational health and safety issues faced by both men and women in the industry, both in the packing house and the field. And in particular, we were able to organize a 3-day workshop on the issue on women in health and safety. That was facilitated by Adela Saki from the IUF, from Anne Apaki, a gender and health and safety specialist and training consultant, from Jennifer Weber, who's the chair of Banana Link, and Dr. Kofi Davids from Golden Exotics Limited. So this was also followed by a full gender-focused risk assessment at a local plantation, at 2 local plantations in Ghana. So this wealth of information was then edited into the first draft of the gender guidelines for Ghana. And this first draft was validated by industry partners in 2020. So Peter's going to go into the specific contents of the guidelines and the changes that have been made for this latest version relevant to the Latin American context. But just to iterate that this first draft of the guidelines that was produced for Ghana, the aim really was to produce a document that could be adapted, something that could not only be adapted to make it relevant to the local context in in different producing countries, but also could be adapted as our expertise in the industry was improved on this important issue. So it's great that we've been able to put that into practice with the Latin American version of the guidelines. So just to reiterate the main objectives of the guidelines. So it was to enable a gender-responsive approach to occupational health and safety issues in the banana industry, which acknowledges that workers are not the same in terms of their biological functions, so the sex differences, and that the jobs that they're allocated, their working conditions, and how they're treated by society are not the same, so gender differences. So the aim is really to better understand the hazards and risks that can affect the health and safety of women in the banana industry, and the risk controls that need to be implemented to protect them. And the original field research in Ghana also highlighted the importance of developing a more holistic view of our vision of worker well-being. So by taking into account not just conditions in the workplace, but also the whole world of work. So this may include the impact that working conditions might have on an employee's life at home and beyond, but also in turn considering how risks in the domestic sphere may impact on a woman's ability to do her job and her health and safety in the workplace. For example, childcare pressures or any conflict or violence that the worker might be suffering at home. So it was with this rather ambitious goal that we embarked on the development of these guidelines. I think it really was a fantastic example of multi-stakeholder collaboration within the industry, from various actors involved in the forum and involved in the local industry in Ghana. So thanks to everyone who was supportive in that and really helped us get that off the ground. And just before passing on to my colleagues, I just wanted to reiterate that the main aim of these guidelines is, of course, to contribute to practical change at plantation level. So there's going to be a real need to accompany the launch of these guidelines with training initiatives and capacity building programs in producing countries. We also really hope that these guidelines will be able to play a role in empowering men and women to better communicate about the specifics, health and safety risks faced by women, but also to feel legitimate in their demands for changes to their working practices based on their physical, physiological, and psychological needs. And of course, these demands are fully justified in international labour law. The ILO conventions number 155 and 187 on occupational health and safety are now included in the ILO's fundamental principles and rights at work. So this is a fantastic development, and we really hope that this will provide an additional incentive for banana industry actors to put these guidelines into practice along their supply chains. So hopefully we will have a bit of time for discussion at the end of this webinar to talk about the next steps and opportunities for putting them into practice. And if not, that'll of course be a key subject on the agenda of our following Gender Equity Task Force calls and also future meetings of the Wild Banana Forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, for this introduction and also a brief summary of how the guidelines came to be in the context of Ghana and of all of the collaboration that took place in its development. I would like to just quickly give a summary, an overview, just to complement a little bit what Pascal had mentioned in the beginning, of the adaptation of the guidelines to the Latin American context, and then we will give the floor to our colleagues in COLSIBA and also Peter Hurst to give a bit more information specifically on what has been included in the document and in the guidelines themselves. So as my colleagues previously mentioned, following the interest that had been expressed by members of the forum, particularly also members of the task force and trade union representatives in the region, to produce a similar document that was produced in Ghana for Latin American stakeholders, FAO, through the World Banana Forum, as Pascal had mentioned, commissioned the adaptation of the guidelines in mid-2020 through a letter of agreement with Banana Link. So under the activities in this agreement, entailed support from a consultant with a sociology and gender background to conduct gender-specific research in the 4 main banana exporting countries of the region related to health and safety of women workers in the industry. So these countries included Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, and Guatemala. And as part of this research, interviews were held with women leaders of the coordinating body of Latin American and Agro-Industrial unions, COLSIBA, which included 1 woman leader from each of the 4 main exporting countries, representing the national trade unions of Sintra y Agro in Colombia, National Union of Agricultural Industry Workers in Colombia, the CITRAP in Costa Rica, which is the Union of Agricultural Plantation Workers, Sinutrabe in Ecuador, the Single National Union of Banana Workers, and CITRAPI, the Izabal Banana Workers Union in Guatemala. The aim of the interviews was to better understand from firsthand experience which health and safety hazards and risks continue to be a challenge for women in the Latin American banana industry. And as I mentioned, we will shortly be hearing from one of the COLSIBA women leaders interviewed, Ms. Adela Torres, precisely on these challenges, both from when these interviews were held back in August of 2020, but also, of course, any other recent challenges being faced today. And the research also entailed secondary research on the legislation in each country related to gender and occupational health and safety. So for instance, on maternity rights, violence and harassment, to better understand as well the institutional context for the protection of health and safety of women in the workplace. So this is research that is referenced throughout the text, but here just laying some information that you will find in the document itself, specifically on inputs and insights from the COLSIBA women leaders, but as well as in the annexes, you can find all the information relevant to the legislations for these 4 countries that address gender-related aspects and also health and safety for women. So moving on to the next slide. So yes, before going to the next slide, we had a first presentation of the guidelines back in March 2021, where we had contributions from Banana Link, from the consultant that was hired to conduct the research that we just mentioned, the interviews with women leaders, as well as legislative information from the 4 countries. But we also had representatives from the Ghanaian banana industry to share and report on the success and the impacts of the guidelines at the company level, which also Anna had just previously shared. And following some in-depth review of the revised version of the document, we also identified that the document did require some additional revisions, particularly with respect to the technical aspects related to occupational health and safety, as well as risk and assessment and risk management. So for instance, classification of hazards, risks, biological processes, and other diseases. And this is, of course, something that Peter will be discussing in the following sections. But in order to be able to address and revise these contents, yes, the Secretariat consulted and worked with occupational health and safety expert Peter Hurst to review the guidelines. And Peter Hurst has also been the one that has supported the revision of the health and safety manuals produced under the World Banana Forum's Banana Occupational Health and Safety Initiative, this is an activity that took place between January and March of this year. So again, we would like to thank Peter for all of his revisions and all of the inputs provided, but of course also to Banana Link and COLSIBA members that also participated in the adaptation of the guidelines as well. And so just very quickly, while the various revisions that were necessary did require, it was quite time demanding, and it was a long process of nearly 2 years to be able to publish the document that we have today. We are very pleased to launch the guidelines officially. And as this is an important resource, and we are quite confident that this is material that will be of great use and benefit to the Latin American banana industry, particularly to women workers. Before I give the floor to Adela Torres from COLSIBA, I just wanted to maybe highlight some of the potential next steps. So as Anna was mentioning, the real aim of these guidelines is to ensure that that companies can ensure gender-sensitive risk assessment and risk management in the workplace. And so as some of the next steps, in order to be able to ensure the use of these guidelines, the World Banana Forum is exploring the opportunities to pilot them in Latin America, looking potentially to start in Ecuador, given that the Banana Occupational Health and Safety Initiative has had great success in the country. And this would be an important addition and next step to the work that has been achieved so far. And so the World Banana Forum's Task Force on Gender Equity is also currently working on a proposal for the implementation of the guidelines in Latin America through these broader trainings on health and safety, risk assessment and risk management, which would aim to cover various countries, not just Ecuador, but extend beyond that to other banana exporting countries in the region. And we hope to be able to present this proposal in forthcoming meetings of the World Banana Forum, and to be able to continue in this effort to ensure that that these guidelines can be used on the ground, and that the companies and workers have the proper training to be able to ensure gender-sensitive risk assessment and risk management. So again, I would also like to take this opportunity to thank all of those organizations that were involved in the adaptation of these guidelines, so Banana Link, COLSIBA, and Peter Hurst. And with that said, I would now like to give the floor to Ms. Adela Torres to provide the insights on the health and safety of women workers in Latin America. Adela, por favor, usted tiene la palabra.
Ok, gracias Camila. Muy buenos días, muy buenas tardes para todos. Soy Adela Torres, coordinadora de COLSIBA, mi sindicato pues en Colombia, Agro. Agradecer a Ana Cooper por la exposición que acaba de hacer con respecto a estas guías que hemos trabajado durante muchos años a través pues, de todo este proceso del Foro Mundial Bananero, y nos parece y nos sentimos muy contentas como organizaciones sindicales de COLSIBA, que se está reflejando un trabajo que durante muchos años pues hemos venido insistiendo desde las organizaciones sindicales con el tema de la salud de las mujeres. Y ha sido un punto que lo hemos llevado al Foro Mundial Bananero, lo hemos discutido en nuestras reuniones que hacemos, incluso las mujeres antes de la conferencia del foro, donde le hemos dado mucha discusión al tema. Sabemos que en muchas organizaciones, en muchas empresas, pues ha habido una sistemática violación de derechos laborales que conllevan a que las mujeres puedan tener unas situaciones bastante complicadas en materia de su salud sexual y reproductiva, en materia de todo el tema de afectaciones por los agroquímicos, en materia de accidentes de trabajo, por condiciones no aptas para ella ejercer su labor en las empacadoras, por falta, digamos, de adecuamiento de los procesos para trabajar. Pero sabemos también que en algunos países se ha venido mejorando estas capacidades para que las mujeres puedan tener un trabajo más seguro. Por ejemplo, mujeres que hoy pueden amamantar a sus hijos en un lugar seguro, o tener donde hacer un proceso de ordeñarse para, bueno, sacar su leche materna para poder seguir trabajando. Entonces, ha sido un trabajo bastante duro, pero sabemos que con esas guías que se está dando, con este proceso podemos empezar a trabajar desde las organizaciones sindicales, con las empresas, la gente de recursos humanos de cada empresa, y poder establecer procesos para que se mejoren estas condiciones. Muchas dificultades a veces con mujeres que están en estado de embarazo. No hay, digamos, a veces sitios adecuados para que ellas lo puedan hacer, la exposición al calor, la exposición a todos estos químicos, eso afecta mucho la salud de las mujeres. Entonces, para nosotros como COLSIBA y Banana Link, por supuesto que hemos venido trabajando de mano para que esto pues pueda tener estos resultados que hoy están haciendo. De verdad que nos sentimos muy contentos porque creo que desde ahí podemos iniciar todo un seguimiento, que es lo que debemos de hacerle a las diferentes plantaciones empezar a hacer el seguimiento y mirar a ver cómo se está dando este trabajo ya en condiciones más humanas, porque como vuelvo y repito, hay condiciones infrahumanas para en algunos países que hemos evidenciado, pero es muy importante pues como todo este trabajo que se ha venido realizando a través de esta investigación que se pudo hacer. Yo creo que hay que resaltar el trabajo que ha venido haciendo el foro, cabeza pues de esta comisión, y la idea es continuar haciendo todo este proceso durante los años y el tiempo que podamos estar ahí en él. Así que pues no me queda más que agradecerles también por ese trabajo, resaltar, valorar este esfuerzo que hoy se está haciendo a nivel mundial para que las plantaciones del sur, de Latinoamérica y de África, en el caso de las compañeras de, sí, de África con Ardua, que sé que ha venido haciendo un trabajo muy importante, pero además otras organizaciones también. Entonces, es eso, pues como muy contenta me siento con este proceso que se ha venido realizando, y yo dejo la palabra para que de pronto otra de las compañeras de COLSIBA pues también puedan dar su apreciación con respecto a este trabajo. Nosotros hemos venido incluso haciendo investigaciones por nuestra propia cuenta en nuestras organizaciones también, en reuniones con las mujeres, y a veces encontramos pues dificultades, pero creo que con esta guía podemos empezar a trabajar para minimizar los riesgos de las mujeres en las plantaciones. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Adela. Primero que nada, si hay alguna pregunta para Adela, les pediría si pueden levantar la mano ahora, porque ella tal vez se tenga que ir antes de que termine este seminario. De lo contrario, si Iris o Doris o otras miembros de COLSIBA quisieran también intervenir y agregar algo, por favor levanten la mano y les daremos la palabra. Porque veo que desafortunadamente el chat no está disponible en este momento, así que Iris o Doris, si quieren agregar algo, por favor les pido que levanten la mano. Bueno, por el momento veo que no han levantado la mano, así que veo que el señor Santos Celestina, por favor, le doy la palabra. Tiene el micrófono habilitado, solamente tiene que activarlo.
Buenos días a todos y a todas, y felicitar pues esta reunión, esta capacitación que se está dando el día de hoy. Bueno, mi nombre es Santos Celestina Carranza Ruiz, de Perú. Tengo el cargo de Secretaría de Seguridad y Medio Ambiente Laboral en la COLSIBA. Muy importante el tema que se está tocando de las mujeres, y también el tema de las enfermedades que venimos sufriendo las mujeres en los centros de labores de trabajo, ¿no? Si bien es cierto, como dice la compañera Adela, pues este es un tema que se viene trabajando hace mucho tiempo con el tema de las mujeres, el respeto de los derechos que tenemos las mujeres. Si bien es cierto, hablamos del sector bananero, pero también tenemos diferentes sectores, tanto de la piña, la caña, trabajadoras en el melón, y también tenemos trabajadoras que trabajan en espárrago, arándanos en Perú. Entonces, todas estas enfermedades ocupacionales, lamentablemente, a pesar que hay leyes en diferentes países, pero en la realidad, en los centros de trabajo, muy poco las empresas los cumplen, ¿no? Entonces, ese es el problema que nosotros venimos atravesando, y que tenemos que seguir luchando para que se pueda pues hacer respetar. Nosotros como mujeres estamos siempre trabajando a través de las reuniones de mujeres en la COLSIBA, y bueno, pues hay muchas dificultades aún ahí, a pesar, como les digo, que las leyes lo dicen, pero las empresas pues en realidad se vuelven sordas y mudas, y no se las cumple en la realidad. Eso nada más quería aportar, y bueno, pues seguir escuchando, porque al principio no pude escuchar en realidad, porque no podía ponerlo a español, estaba en inglés. Más bien disculpen. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, señora Santa Celestina, y bueno, qué pena que no haya podido escuchar el inicio también con el tema de la interpretación, pero para su referencia, en caso de que no lo haya hecho ahora, tiene la opción abajo, en la barra de abajo, interpretación al español. Pero muchas gracias por sus contribuciones. Sí, bueno, como mi colega Víctor también está escribiendo, pueden también formular sus preguntas en la sesión de preguntas y respuestas, también está en la barra de abajo, y nosotros responderemos o verbalmente después o les responderemos en el chat ahí. Bueno, entonces veo que no hay otra mano levantada en este momento, así que me gustaría darle la palabra al señor Peter Hurst para que continúe con el tema de la agenda, que sería poder presentar en más detalle cuáles han sido los cambios importantes que se han hecho en estas directrices de género. Perdón, Peter, veo que recién ha levantado la mano la señora Doris, así que me gustaría darle la palabra primero antes de que sigamos. Ok, gracias, Peter. Sí, Doris, tiene el micrófono habilitado, por favor, tiene que activarlo nomás y tiene la palabra. Doris, no la escuchamos, tiene que activar el micrófono. Ahí sí.
Ahí.
Sí, perfecto.
Buenos días
Buenos
a
días,
todos.
Doris.
No sé si allá, buenas tardes, donde están ustedes, ¿verdad? Agradecer esta participación de estar hoy aquí, esta mañana, en este seminario reunión. Pues no me hubiese gustado haber estado de un inicio, pero no podía ingresar. Tuve que ubicar a la compañera Adela para que poder ingresar y no pude. Traté de concentrarme, pero bueno, pues en lo poco que logré escuchar, sería bueno que a lo mejor a nuestros correos nos manden el resumen de lo que se está viendo el día de hoy, en español, por supuesto, porque tuve el mismo enredo también como la compañera Santo. Soy Doris Zulema García Canales, nicaragüense, de la organización ATC, del departamento de Chinandega, todo lo que es la zona de Occidente, zona tropical meramente. Actualmente estoy coordinando el trabajo de la mujer en la COLSIBA, y lastimosamente pues y oportunamente dar gracias, porque es primera experiencia, primera reunión. Yo he estado en varias reuniones, pero de manera presencial al lado de Europa, a través de Banana Link, que Banana Link sí ha sido un pilar fundamental para las organizaciones en América Latina, en especial para la COLSIBA, y ahí estamos tratando de encaminar todo el trabajo de la COLSIBA, coordinando la compañera Adela lo que es la COLSIBA y el trabajo de la mujer, su servidora, ¿verdad? Sabemos que las mujeres hoy en día ha sido una lucha larga, desde que por la gran necesidad que teníamos las mujeres fue que en el año 94, 95 nos fundamos como movimiento de mujeres de América Latina para unirnos y poder salir adelante con nuestros derechos. Y sabemos que las empresas, después de la pandemia de los huracanes y lo que es la pandemia del COVID, ha sido los momentos más duros que las mujeres están pasando en los diferentes países. Porque por estos fenómenos de los huracanes están los daños y las mayores sufridas, porque en su gran mayoría somos jefas de hogar, somos las mujeres en los diferentes países. Hay un desastre natural que se inundó, lo que vienen los recortes, y las primeras que van enlistadas son las mujeres. Y yo creo que desde Europa deberían de echar un ojo a estos países, cómo es que están dándole el trato a las trabajadoras, es un tanto difícil. Cada día para nosotras como mujeres se nos hace más difícil nuestra situación, máxime donde somos jefas de hogar. Porque, por ejemplo, en Perú a cada rato hay problemas, se produce, ya decía la compañera Santos, en cuánta producción están inmersas las mujeres, y en algunos países la situación es más difícil. Por ejemplo, en Perú, la situación del trabajador y en especial de las mujeres es una situación bien difícil. Las condiciones laborales, a cada rato las echan, les tienen sin cuidado que sean dirigentes sindicales. Es una situación bien difícil. Yo creo que desde Europa pues nos pueden echar la mano en que recomendar que los consumidores como que se organizaran más como para echarnos la mano en el sentido de que desde allá ustedes presionen que si no hay condiciones laborales para nosotras, entonces la producción, el comercio también estaría en peligro, porque de otra manera en nuestros países es mentira. Es mentira. Entonces tienen que tomarse a veces las calles. Ya ves cuánta situación ha pasado en Panamá con los trabajadores y trabajadoras, y no todo tampoco puede ser tan difícil. Si uno agradece, ahí estamos. De todas maneras, aquí vamos a seguir y esperando que ustedes siempre pues nos sigan dando la mano para seguir, y me gustaría que seguir participando en todos los eventos de la que corresponde a la Comisión de la Mujer del Foro Mundial Bananero para por lo menos estar al tanto pues de todo, y esperando que siempre nos estén alimentando con estos seminarios que sabemos que son de mucha importancia. Muy bien lo decía la compañera Adela. Hay en algunos países que sí se ha avanzado, que sí hay leyes que vienen a beneficiar bastante y se fortalece, pero hay en algunos países que la situación es bien difícil. Pero bueno, ahí estamos, y lo que nos queda es seguir la lucha, es seguir, nada para atrás, siempre empujando para adelante, y darle las gracias pues por esta experiencia, y que ahí estamos haciendo el esfuerzo por sacar adelante nuestra familia, nuestra producción, nuestra sociedad y por ende nuestros países y nuestra organización como es la COLSIBA, que siempre ha estado de la mano con Banana Link, con el compañero Alistair, que ha sido un pilar fundamental para apoyarnos allá. Desde Europa, apoyarnos aquí y viceversa. Ahí estamos.
Muchas gracias, Dori, por sus contribuciones, y bueno, entendemos también lo que usted está mencionando. Justamente es el objetivo de estas directrices también, de poder dar este apoyo a los diferentes actores, a las compañías, a los trabajadores, para poder asegurar unas mejores condiciones de trabajo también, que tomen en cuenta las necesidades de las mujeres trabajadoras, ¿no? Así que esperamos que este documento y lo que va a presentar nuestro colega, el señor Peter Hurst, en estos próximos minutos, también sea útil para ustedes, y esperamos que en el futuro también, como mencionaba anteriormente, se pueda también pilotear y bueno, llevar a cabo actividades para implementar estas directrices en las plantaciones, en la evaluación de los riesgos en el lugar de trabajo, ¿no? Así que bueno, muchas gracias, Doris, y tomado en cuenta también sus comentarios. Ahora me gustaría darle la palabra al señor Peter Hurst para que continuemos a presentar un poco más en detalle cuáles han sido los cambios principales a estas directrices y bueno, cómo se podrían
Good
implementar.
afternoon.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, please go ahead, Peter.
Yeah,
You
okay,
have the floor.
fine. Okay, I'll say good day to everyone. Can you move down the next slide? I'd just like to say thanks, first of all, to the WBF Secretariat and the Gender Task Force for their help in refining these, well, I think they're called Latin American Caribbean guidelines, if I'm not mistaken. And I just would point out that when we're talking about the launch of these guidelines, these Latin American guidelines, we should also obviously make reference to the revisions which have been made to the guidelines for Ghana and Cameroon, and also to link these to the revised manuals for Ghana, Cameroon, which with the process have been discussed and adopted, because we've now harmonized text between the different guidelines and, more importantly, with the manuals. So when we're talking about, for example, risk assessment, we're talking about consistent language and consistent approach. And I think that's important when we're dealing with managers, workers, and governments around the world to have sort of harmonized text. So many thanks. And I'd just like to say before I finish on that, a special thanks to Anna, to Agat, Holly, and Jenny from Banana Link, who were especially a valuable resource. So my thanks. Next, please. So the guidelines start off by saying that the world of work has been created principally by men, and many the women have entered into the jobs later on. So what we've tried to do in revising these Latin American guidelines is get them very firmly into modern practice, modern mainstream practice on health and safety, workplace risk assessment and management, and more importantly, the risk controls that we need to see put in place if we're going to save people's lives and limbs. And we especially made reference to ILO standards and materials, and I'll talk about that more shortly. So we obviously want to obviously talk about prevention of prevention of fatalities, injuries, and occupational disease. But we also want to help create a decent and dignified working condition for women workers, and to improve management of their work tasks and work schedules. And we've also made reference to the FAO materials. When you're talking about health and safety, often people get fixated on the problems, the hazards. We're actually in the business of trying to put things right, the solutions, the risk controls that we need to save lives and limbs and lungs. So that's what I'll try and focus on. Next, please. And in doing this, we're stressing the importance of promoting cooperation between employers and managers on health and safety, and also empowering women managers and workers to actually prevent fatalities, injuries, and occupational disease. It's not just workers, it's both. Because my experience of working on health and safety around the world and doing training, for example, in different countries, even if it's a worker course, I often end up with lots of managers on the course because they don't simply get enough training. And so that's a very important thing to bear in mind, that we're dealing both with managers and workers. And we want to enable them to look at not just the health, the fatality, the injury side, but also the whole business of how do we ensure decent working facilities, dignity, and general an ability to manage and adjust their work tasks and schedules. Next, please. I was contacted by Camila, Victor, and Pascal to help review the language, especially on the terms hazard and risk, which they felt in the first draft of the guidelines were used interchangeably, and there needed to be some clarification of this. And so I've been helping with the restructuring and supplementing the text on this area. So if we look at the actual main changes, the way we restructured, first of all, we had the based on the interviews, we had the materials submitted by COLSIBA on the key hazards and risks. Next, please. And what we've done is we've just put them in a sort of the following order, because there was a little bit confusion between which was the hazard and which was the risk. So COLSIBA especially focused on exposure to chemical products, and we'll talk more about that shortly. They focus very much on stress at work for the women workers. And of course, the very important topic of sexual harassment and violence at work, but also linked to domestic violence, which links into the new ILO Convention, number 190 on violence and harassment at work. And obviously the very important issue of physically demanding and/or repetitive work, which can result in the risk of musculoskeletal disorders. Next, please. So we dealt with COLSIBA's hazards and risks. We had a text on that, and we will, as I say, we'll discuss that shortly. But then we also looked at some of the other things that have been listed, and we then said, right, we need to create a sort of section dealing with women's biological processes, which are normal processes, which you can't just set in the context of hazard and risk. It doesn't fit. So what we're doing is we've sorted out the biological processes in terms of menstruation, pregnancy and breastfeeding, the perimenopause, the menopause, the postmenopause, put some new language on that. And these are very much issues where workplace facilities need to be improved and work tasks and schedules adjusted. And of course, if there were any particular risks arising to any of these biological processes, we'd need to deal with them as well. But we feel that's a clearer presentation of the various issues. Next, please. The next section that we added was chapter 5 on what is called diseases and miscellaneous. And these are diseases for which there is no clear occupational link. But nevertheless, provision needs to be made by the companies, the employers, in terms of the work facilities, especially things like hygiene, sanitation, and in work tasks and schedules. And we took these from the original draft. So we're dealing with breast cancer. Now, breast cancer can obviously be occupationally linked. You can link it to chemicals, you can link it to stress and the like, but also the origins of breast cancer are wider. So we thought it best fitted under the heading of a broad heading of occupational disease. Next, there is information on miscarriage. And then on fibroids, but that's the Spanish translation of fibromas, which are, again, diseases that are linked to the uterus, but you cannot make a strong, clear occupational link. It seems that actually no one knows the origins of fibroids, but they are things that can affect women, especially in later life. And then you have the old issue of endometriosis, which is where the uterus, the cells in the uterus start growing outside of the uterus, which can lead to pain and discomfort. But again, no clear occupational link, but nevertheless, they need to be factored in by employers and companies when providing work facilities and working out work tasks and schedules. And then there was a section on transmission of HIV from mother to child, which is advice on how, by certain preventative measures, you can lower the risk of transmission from mother to child in case this disease, this sadly is sadly prevalent. And then the whole issue of reproductive work deals with the extra burden that women workers have in terms of household chores and looking after as child carers and the like. And that needs to be factored into any sort of work program. The gaps in the agenda data deals with, sorry, I just need to refresh my memory on this one. I've slightly lost, let me just see, just 1 second. I can't quite remember what we said on that, if you bear with me. Yeah, gaps in gender data. We were, yeah, I think we were looking at the lack of information on hazards and risks to women workers and the need that we need to sort of start addressing how we can improve the data collection and the discussion. Next. What we then did next, having sort of put in a section on hazards and risks as per COLSIBA, a section on biological processes for women workers, and then a section on diseases and miscellaneous issues. We then have added text on workplace risk assessment and management because we felt that was particularly lacking. So we've introduced a workplace risk assessment and management framework, and this matches in with the frameworks that we've added to the other guidelines and to the manuals. So we can improve the prevention of fatalities and injuries and at the same time talk about improving workplace facilities and schedules. And so we give clear definitions of hazard and risk. We outline the 5 steps of risk assessment, and we outline the hierarchy of 6 risk controls. And I'm going to briefly run through each of these 3 areas. Next, please. In doing this, we've used a wide range of material, but especially we focused on the training package on workplace risk assessment and management for small and medium-sized enterprises, because we felt this was particularly relevant. And this was looking at risk assessment systems around the world. So it's a compendium, you know, it's a summary of different risk assessment systems. And we feel that's, and this resource, I should say, is available in Spanish. Next, please. So this is the reference, and where I would stress that the same methodology applies to larger scale enterprises such as plantations. And I was the kind of main author for this particular training package. So yeah, we did look comprehensively around the world. Next, please. One of the things we've added to the manual, and we think this is important, is to actually come up with, when we're talking about hazard and risk, the terms get used very loosely. As we say, there's confusion in everyday language. But I think the first thing, it's useful to have a definition of hazard. And so we've said that a hazard could be anything. And it's not just physical materials or articles. It's not, say, a piece of dangerous machinery or a tractor or a forklift truck. It's not a substance in the sense of a pesticide or a banana latex dispersant or equipment. It can also be poor work organization and lack of safe systems of work or bad work practices. So in other words, if a workplace is badly managed, the work is poorly organized and the practices are not safe, then that in itself is a hazard and a major cause of fatalities and injuries and disease. And so the hazard is anything that can cause injury or disease to people and or damage to the environment. I think we need to link the health and safety that we're doing with environment. And this is especially the case when we're dealing with issues like pesticide, which obviously don't just stay on the plantation, but affect neighboring communities. And in fact, it can even spread globally. And when you look at a banana plantation or any other sort of agricultural workplace, you're going to see a very large number of potential hazards. And we have to sort of try and group these and then think more importantly, how do we control the risks? So next, please. We then have introduced a definition of risk. And the definition, I'll just read it quickly, is that it's the probability, sometimes people say chance or likelihood, that a hazard will result in injury, disease, I put in brackets illness, it's probably better to say occupational disease, and or the environment. And basically, risk is you just take the severity of harm. Is the risk going to result in a fatality? Is it going to result in a serious injury? Or is it a cut on the hand, which you can treat with the plaster? And you multiply that by the probability of harm. And this is where we need to do lots of training, because once you get the concept of risk across the workers and management, then they can really start to manage the risk, and more importantly, start to the lower risks. So to move from higher risk situations to the lower risk areas. So there's clear definitions of hazard and risk. Next, please. We then introduced, based on the ILO material, a 5-step approach to risk assessment. And the 5-step approach to risk assessment is, first of all, identify the hazards. What are the articles, the substances, the poor work organization that's going to harm a worker? Could be a fatal accident, could be a serious injury, could be a minor injury, and of course the whole issue of occupational disease. But hazard identification, the important first step. And this is based on going into the workplace. I'm going to say this quite again. When we're talking about this type of risk assessment, this is workplace risk assessment with the active participation of the workers. And I'll explain in a minute why I'm making that statement. Workplace risk assessment with the active participation of the workers, because this is often what is not being done by companies. We then have to work out who is at risk, which workers are at risk, and the degree of risk. Are we talking about high, medium, low risk, whatever, or something in between? And we can talk more about that later. And then importantly, you move to the heart of risk assessment, step 3, which is the important critical step. This is about putting things right, about the solutions. And we have to get the employers in cooperation with the workers to decide on and implement the risk controls following something called the hierarchy of risk controls, which I'll explain shortly. You then have step 4, take action. So who takes action? Is it the company health and safety officer? Is it another member of management? Will a worker have a role? And you have to decide how the action will be taken, and more importantly, when. There's no point saying high risk and then saying, oh, we'll do something about it in 6 months. High risk means imminent and serious danger, and it means you do something.
Es un peligro inminente. Y eso hay que tomarlo en cuenta dentro de horas o días. Es algo inminente, entonces.
Repeat the risk assessment intervals. Risk assessment is a cycle. It's not just a one-off activity. It's something you do constantly.
Es algo que tiene que ser constantemente.
Plantation, where you can take a specific part of the plantation or a specific work process. It's a flexible tool which can help companies in cooperation with their workers.
Entender mejor en comparación con los trabajadores.
Next, please. The hierarchy of risk controls, which is the heart of risk assessment. And this is where when training, we need to spend time, because this is the area, I think, where some clarification and more detail would benefit the process at FAO, the World Banana Forum, BOHESI have been taking forward in cooperation with the unions and companies. The first thing is we say, can we eliminate or substitute the hazard? A classic example would be, can we use integrated pest management to eliminate the use of a toxic pesticide? Can we actually get a less noisy machine working at less than 86 decibels? Can we use that in the place of a noisy machine which will damage hearing? So that's always the first step to be considered. And if an employer says elimination is not possible, we need a rationale why that is not possible. It's not just simply good enough to say, I can't eliminate the use of a pesticide. Who did you actually get that advice from that you couldn't do that? You need to say, was it the local agricultural advisor or whoever? If elimination is not possible, we move on to the whole business of can we use tools, equipment, technical and engineering controls. So can we control the dust in the workplace by use of exhaust ventilation equipment? Can we use equipment such as lifting equipment to save people's backs and shoulders and general muscle system? We then need to link that to safe work organization systems, practices, information and training. And this seems to be in some of the material produced so far, an area where we need to do more. It was often missing, the whole business of occupational risk controls was often missing or poorly stated. So we need to improve that, but it's very critical. Basically, if you want good health and safety conditions in the workplace, then that workplace is going to have to be organized. It doesn't matter whether it's a small workplace, a medium-sized workplace, or a large plantation. Safe work organization really is the key. That's why we have to get the managers and the workers motivated and involved, because they're the ones who can put things right, basically. The next area we need to consider is what's water, sanitation, hygiene, first aid, and welfare. We often use the English acronym WASH, W-A-S-H. But clearly, if we want decent conditions at work, if you want to avoid disease, but if you also want to give women workers decent conditions when during the course of their work, then clearly a good provision of these facilities is important. And it's not just in the main plantation, it's not just in the pack house. This also needs to apply to the field workers. And we also should make sure we include office workers. Office workers on plantations often get left out. They don't seem to figure it. So we also need to make sure the office workers are included. Then and only then do we come to personal protective equipment. And personal protective equipment is linked as the fifth risk control because it's there to boost the other control measures, what we call the collective protective measures, the tools, the safe work, and water sanitation. It should not be, in most cases, a first line of protection. Now, we know from our experience around the world on banana plantations and other parts of agriculture that often personal protective equipment is the only sort of protective measure that happens. And when we're dealing with protective equipment, one of the things we have to say, first of all, if protective equipment is, if the risk assessment decides that protective equipment is needed to boost the other control measures, we then need to say what type of protective equipment. So if we were doing dust control, do we use the familiar mask, which you've seen, or do we use this? Because this, I have no idea exactly what level of dust particles, or in this case, COVID particles, this mask would take out. This mask, which is FFP2, will take up 92% protection against COVID particles, COVID virus droplets, sorry, not particles. So it's important to, when we're dealing with personal protective equipment, and we've highlighted this in the manual, to say the type of equipment, and you have to recognize the difference between women workers and men workers. The same equipment, same type of mask doesn't necessarily fit both. So you've got to see whether it's gender specific. And then you will also need to know the protection factor. It's not good enough to say mask. You have to get the protection factor. And this is information you get from manufacturers. And then you have to know the maintenance schedules. If it's a type of protective equipment which needs washing or some other form of maintenance, what is the maintenance schedule recommended by the company? And the other important side is the replacement. How often, say in case of a disposal mask, are you replacing these on a daily basis? Are you replacing them on 2 or 3 days? So these all have to be stated in the risk assessment. And the last area is sometimes you could use medical health surveillance. So for example, if you're using certain types of pesticides, certain types of insecticides, you can take a blood sample and you can measure whether you're actually being poisoned by another blood test, say in 2 or 3 weeks' time. And the motto is, when we talk about the hierarchy of risk controls, is collective protection controls always have priority over individual protection controls. And that's a message we've got to get through in the training to both the managers and workers. Too often we end up dealing with personal protective equipment and very little else. And one of the things we've discovered, that and this is through the using these materials, in this case in Africa, is what we found with banana companies in Africa, that they are actually not carrying out the type of workplace health and safety risk assessment that we're talking about. They're doing a desk job. And that's not sufficient. It's not good enough. It's not going to protect health and safety in the of the workers. On the other side, if you do workplace risk assessment, you could also strengthen and expand worker representative systems. And that's going to be very important that we do that. So this whole area, is a sort of key part of what we've added. And this is where we need further discussion of how we take this forward and how we get the companies, for example, to start with workplace risk assessment and move away from what they've been doing. I have no idea in Latin America what the companies are doing in terms of risk assessment, and that's something through the training, etc., and the follow-up work that we need to find out, and then we can prioritize and target. Next, please. We then, in chapter 7, provided more information and training material. We had chapter 3 from COLSIBA, but there are clearly other hazards and risks which need to be there. And we've added a section on organizational hazards and risks, because strangely, this seems to be missing from much of the previous World Banana Forum material. And basically, a lot of injuries and a lot of occupational disease happen at work, including fatalities, simply because there's no safe systems of work, or working hours are excessive, or there's continuous working, there's a lack of days off. So we've introduced language on safe systems of work, and we've obviously then characterize some of the other main hazards and risks, the chemicals, pesticides, the fertilizers, the latex dispersants, and the disinfectants. We've put further emphasis on the whole business of physically demanding repetitive work, because that's really is one of the major problems in agriculture. People's back, people's arms, people's legs ache, and this is especially true of women workers doing repetitive work in the pack house or other areas. And then, as was mentioned, that there are also things we need to consider, like extreme temperatures, working in the sun, slips and falling over. And then the whole business of occupational diseases, bites, stings. We've then got the psychosocial side to reconsider. That was highlighted by COLSIBA. We've re-highlighted it here, and we can try and provide more details and information. And then also bring in the whole area of dangerous machinery, the vehicles and transport, because you'll often find workers on plantations are working near or with actually unguarded machinery, and they are at serious and imminent danger of very serious accidents, including, sadly, fatalities. So more information there, and this links to the information we provided in the revised manuals and like. Next, please. Moving towards the end now. Chapter 8 then provides, as Anna mentioned at the beginning, provides further information and training material on 10 ILO guidelines on gender-sensitive health and safety practices. So there's further information in that chapter. Next, please. So with that, I'll finish and take any questions. I hope that wasn't too long or too involved, but I hope that gives you a flavor of what we tried to do.
Thank you very much, Peter. No, we have plenty of time. So yes, thank you very much for this very brief overview of the main changes and to the guidelines. We would like to ask if any participants have any questions or any comments specifically regarding what Peter has just presented, or anything about the guidelines themselves, or if you would like to contribute any thoughts on this piece of work that has been recently published. If so, please feel free to raise your hand and we can give you the floor. Or feel free to also write in the Q&A. I see there is a comment already here. Chito Quintero, excellent presentation. Thank you very much. Also to you, Peter. Thanks, Peter, for this practical insight once again. Can the WBF and sponsors issue participants corresponding certificates on these trainings to provide evidence during external inspection and audit? If you're referring to this specific session, this is just a webinar. So this is not a specific, let's say, training session. It is just to launch the guidelines. But of course, we can consider that in future events.
Yeah. Hi, Emmanuel. Hi. Well, no, we've done, using the new material, we've done some training with the companies where Emmanuel works, with the other two banana plantation companies, and I think we're trying to work towards actually moving towards workplace risk assessment in these companies and moving on from the desk job they're doing. And I think it's perfectly legitimate at some stage to consider certificates. People always want a certificate when you train them, because then they can use this certificate for a variety of purposes. So maybe that's something we need to discuss. But hello, Emmanuel, if you're there.
Yes, thank you, Peter. I see also Fausto Rovalino from Ecuador is also writing. La gestión, the evaluation of risk must be conducted by the workers, men and women workers. They are the ones that need to identify the hazard, evaluate the risk, and also to control it. This is key for the evaluation of risks. Have you considered this process in the trainings, is the question, Peter?
Well, what we tried to do is, in terms of the training material, and again, this applies to other guidelines and manuals, we're trying to move the whole things to a system of workplace risk assessment, whereby the employers, the company, the managers, in cooperation with the worker reps and the workers, they actually go into the workplace and they look and sort out what the hazards are, and more importantly, what the risk controls are. Hazard identification is the easy part of risk assessment because, quite frankly, we know most of the hazards that will kill a worker, will harm a worker, or result in disease are pretty well known. What's more important is what you do about it, the solutions, the risk controls. And that's the area we need to work on. But yes, I mean, the whole business of risk controls is very, very firmly at the center of the training material. In other words, it's getting managers and workers used to using the hierarchy of risk controls and following them, and not just saying, oh, well, you know, we'll use a bit of protective equipment and think we're all safe, because that's not the case. And once you've got that discipline into that information and that kind of discipline amongst the managers and workers, you can really move forward. And then you see some pretty interesting results. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you, Peter. Let's see I hope it answers the question, but feel free to add in the chat, Fausto, in the Q&A if you have any additional questions. We also see there's another question from Helga here. What are the most important differences you have found between the Ghanaian and the Latin American context?
At the minute, we've been, in terms of practically using some of this material, we've been concentrating on the African situation, and especially Ghana. So we haven't really sort of done this in the Latin American context. So it's an open-ended question. But I suspect one of the things we will find, we need to find out what the companies, the banana companies in Latin America, what they do in the different countries in terms of risk assessment and risk management. Are they actually going into workplaces and actually in cooperation with the workers carrying out workplace risk assessments, where they will look at a dangerous machine and work out the degree of risk, and more importantly, decide what to do in terms of making sure that machine is properly guarded. I suspect we might find a lot of desk jobs where the companies are doing what we call desktop risk, kind of form of desktop risk assessment. We need to move them on to doing workplace risk assessment, and you do this by the managers and the workers going in the workplace together. So to answer your question, well, we can't really answer your question, Helga, at the minute, because we just haven't sort of tried this material, this revised material in the Latin American context.
Thank you, Peter. Maybe just to add very quickly, indeed, what Peter is mentioning. So these guidelines have just recently been published, and the objective will be to, as we mentioned earlier in the session, to explore the possibility of being able to implement some trainings on the ground, broader trainings on health and safety risk assessment, but also ensuring that the guidelines are being used in these trainings to ensure that companies can conduct gender-sensitive risk assessments that will also take into consideration the specific needs of women workers. So we are hoping to be able to start the implementation of these guidelines, maybe in the short term, but this is of course still in the process of being explored. I see that Anna has her hand raised. So Anna, please, you have the floor.
Yeah, just in response to Helga's question, yeah, although we haven't yet gone through the process of implementing the guidelines and therefore getting more detailed information, of course, when we went through the process of adapting the Ghanaian guidelines to the Latin American context, we did get feedback from COLSIBA, and yeah, did get quite a lot of qualitative information from both female workers in Ghana and female workers in Latin America. And I think one of the main differences that we saw was the percentage of women workers working in the field in Ghana. So yeah, this is a lot higher than in general in Latin America. So obviously there were a lot more risks hazards that were identified in the Ghanaian context that were specifically related to women's experience working in the field. And these were things that then, when it came to adapting the manual to the Latin American context, women felt were less relevant, or, a very small percentage of women had actually experienced of that because of the difference in working practices in Latin America. So yeah, and another issue that came out was we did seem to get a feedback from Latin American colleagues that there seem to be a lot more examples of repetitive strain industries, so injuries like the túnel carpeo, from repetitive working in the packing houses, which I think again is probably related to different working practices. So yeah, I think in terms of the intensity of the production process in Latin America, that's one of the differences that we did see. But it would be great to get input from other people on this call who were working in both countries, who've spoken to workers in the African region and Latin American region about that as well, to get your feedback on that, because it's an interesting question.
Yeah. I mean, okay, can I just add a quick comment there? One thing, when we've been helping revise the manuals and the guidelines, we put in a section on what workers actually think are the main health and safety problems, because originally this seemed to be missing from the original manuals. And we found good information on what women workers, some good information on what women workers, based on the FAO regional reports that Anna did on behalf of the FAO in 2015, the regional ones, which covered all the regions. When you come to men workers, there's virtually no information on what men workers think is the main hazards and risks in the banana sector. It really is a quite surprising gap, whether you look at Latin America, whether you look at Asia Pacific, or whether you look at Africa. So there are data gaps, and that's one of the things we also need to address, because we need better collection of information. Agriculture is notorious for underreporting of injuries and disease. And I suspect we'll also find that as a problem in the Latin American industry.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Peter. So there's also another question here for Mr. Schauenberg. Would I be right in thinking that workplace risk assessments cannot be properly conducted without the presence of trained health and safety representatives from recognized trade unions?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. When you're dealing with health and safety, and this applies to any industry, any sector, and whether it's workers, management, outside people providing outside health and safety services, they have to be competent. And competence is defined as people who are qualified, trained, experienced in the relevant, in health and safety in their particular sector, and who actually know what they're doing and can help put things right. And so obviously we need to make sure that worker representatives are well trained and know what they're doing, not just simply the managers. Now, this is where trade unions can really make a difference, because one of the approaches that IUF takes, for example, and I was the health and safety specialist for IUF for 5 years, is that that in many countries the worker reps will be selected by the trade union. So we need to also find out which of the Latin American countries has this provision, or where there is a more general requirement in the law for safety reps. But there are two types of safety reps. One is a general safety rep working on a banana plantation, who will deal with health and safety on a day-to-day basis. And they're often the type of health and safety rep that's missing in industry and on plantations. And so we need to encourage companies to try and help create worker health and safety representative systems. The general rep who goes onto the plantation on a Monday morning, deals with an accident, deals with a problem concerning maternity leave or a sexual harassment case. The second type of worker rep is the worker representative on health and safety committees. And so we need to encourage more women to be members of the health and safety committee and to participate. So yes, we need to link it back to the trade unions, but also it's important to ensure that the worker reps have some basis in law in the country. In other words, they're legally empowered to carry out their duties, and they're legally protected, and they have time off from work, etc., to do this work, and they have protection from dismissal. As we heard, we heard the comments from Doris about Peru, the difficulties. So there has to be we have to encourage worker reps. It's the key to actually improving health and safety linked to good management. Thank
you, Peter. I see there's also a comment from our colleagues here in the Trade and Markets Division. Thank you for the important work on the gender issues. Congratulations on the launch of the guidelines. Thank you very much, Ivina. Thank you. And I see there are some comments here from Chito Quintero about some of the work that they are doing on the ground. If you'd like to take a look, Peter. But just commenting on some of the work. So I see no hands raised at the moment. Again, in case participants would like to say something, we can enable your microphone, so there's no need to just write in the question and answer chat. So we're more than happy to give you the floor. You just please raise your hand and we can enable your microphone. I see no hands. Oh, I see one hand has been raised. Fausto Robalino. Sí, le voy a activar el micrófono, señor Robalino. Está activado, ahora solamente
Mr. Robalino, your microphone is now enabled, so you just have to go turn on your microphone now. Go ahead.
Quickly, Camila, yes, we could do that. We could showcase a template if you want to prepare it. The one on
I have it.
musculoskeletal. Yeah, okay.
I have COVID-19. That's fine.
Yeah, COVID-19 is perfect. In fact, we'll get them doing it first.
Okay. Señor Robalino, por favor, tiene la palabra.
Ok, sí, una observación nada más. Lo que habíamos comentado, la gestión de riesgo siempre tiene que ser aterrizada o bajada a nivel ya de trabajador. Muchas veces uno de los problemas que nos hemos encontrado, y sobre todo aquí en Latinoamérica, es que la gestión de riesgo se basa fundamentalmente más en una gestión directiva, pero no llegamos a que esa gestión de riesgo sea manejada por el trabajador, que comprenda qué es una identificación de peligros, cómo yo evalúo un riesgo y cómo lo controlo. En definitiva, para el éxito de una gestión de riesgos va a ser que el trabajador maneje apropiadamente todo el proceso, ¿no?, de identificación, evaluación y control de riesgos. Esa sería mi observación.
Muchas gracias, Fausto.
Okay, could I come in on that?
Yes, of course. Go ahead.
I think what we tried to spell out in the guidelines and also linked to the manuals is that when you're talking about workplace health and safety risk assessment, it is the legal duty of the employer, because there's been some confusion over this. So in other words, the employer has this is a legal duty. Now, in discharging that legal duty, an employer is perfectly entitled to work with workers. We always encourage the employer where they can to carry out their own risk assessment, because especially when you're dealing with small, medium-sized enterprises, they can really use it as a self-help tool. So they can get the workers helping with the risk assessment or part of the risk assessment. They can bring in outside services if they're not that confident to help with the risk assessment, as long as these outside services are competent people. You have to be careful in health and safety. There's a lot of people who say they know a lot about health and safety, and the truth is they do not. And this is a problem that governments often have to regulate. But when an employer or a company carries out risk assessment, and even if they do it with workers and an outside service, they remain legally responsible. You cannot transfer legal responsibility to a third party. Not possible. In other words, if you're legally responsible under law, then you have to discharge that duty no matter who you cooperate with. I don't know if that's clear, but you can't suddenly say, oh, well, it's the workers who are responsible for this. Or it's I hired a third-party company and they didn't do a very good risk assessment. It's their problem, because the employers have to sort of take responsibility. The company has to take responsibility. You cannot transfer a legal duty to a third party, not possible in law. And I should add that I'm a former health and safety labour inspector in agriculture. So I used to deal with the law in terms of not just of the farms and plantations and workforce, but I also used to deal with this in the courts.
Thank you, Peter. Fausto, espero que sí, si tiene algún otro comentario con respecto a lo que ha mencionado Peter, por favor, le doy la palabra. Y después veo que el señor Javier Villasís también ha levantado la mano.
Sí, solo para complementar, sí sería la parte de la metodología para la identificación de peligros, evaluación de riesgos y controles sea sencilla, ¿no? Sea sencilla para que el trabajador pueda manejar esta herramienta de trabajo. Definitivamente lo que tenemos que incorporar son metodologías sencillas para que a nivel de trabajadores se pueda utilizar una herramienta que sea muy manejable por ellos, en la cual yo identifico un peligro de manera sencilla y yo ya conozco cuáles son mis peligros, en la cual yo evalúo un riesgo, calificándolo de bajo, medio o alto, y finalmente ya estableciendo controles junto con la parte técnica. Entonces, sobre todo, poner énfasis esto en utilizar una metodología sencilla, fácil, que sea muy digerible para los trabajadores.
Yeah, okay, thanks for those comments, and that's my sentiment exactly. If we were doing this as a full risk assessment training, one of the first slides you would see would be a big slogan saying, keep it simple. Keep it simple. And often when I start doing risk assessment training with workers and managers, I often don't start saying we're doing risk assessment training. I'm saying, hey, we're going to talk about health and safety and talk about solutions. And then on the second day, when the workers have got the hang of what they're doing on risk assessment, I say, congratulations, you've just been doing risk assessment. You've now become risk assessment. So keeping it simple is important. If you can't agree whether the risk is high or moderate, medium, don't waste too much time on it. The key thing is to look at the risk controls and put those in place and follow the hierarchy. Don't just start with protective equipment, waving this around and think you're solving things. You've got to do the elimination, the technical engineering, the safe work organization, the water hygiene, sanitation, before you get to protective equipment. But keep it simple by all means.
Thank you, Peter. I see that Anna also wanted to comment on the information shared by Fausto. So Anna, please, you have the floor.
Hi, yeah, no, it was just really in support of what Peter was saying, but I think just the other issue that we've definitely documented in the case of Banana Link is that, of course, it's important that the workers are the ones working at the field and aware of the health and safety issues that they face on a daily basis. But the problem with making it their responsibility to report on that and not having a structure that's fully implemented by employers and a responsibility taken on by employers is that of course in many cases workers are aware of the risks that they face during their work, but they have a fear of documenting, talking about those risks, of raising those risks with plantation supervisors and with employers, because they worry about the impacts that will have on their employment. And I think that's something that was raised as well by the question that Bert Schaumbach asked about the importance of health and safety representatives also being members of a trade union. That I think if someone is in a position where they are reporting these issues for work and health and safety, then it's also important to consider the protections that they have in terms of representation, and also that those workers are really informed on the fact that that working in a health and safety environment is a right that's protected in national legislation and in international legislation. So I think that would be something that's really important to put across as well in any health and safety training that takes place in plantations.
Yeah, I mean, that's very important. You've got to get the worker reps centrally involved, but you can't allow employers to shift their responsibility onto workers or a third party when they're legally responsible. That was a misunderstanding, I think, not in these particular guidelines, but in other publications. I think hopefully we've made those corrections. And clearly, when you've got worker, if you then bring in Convention 184 on safety and health in agriculture, this says workers shall have the right to select their health and safety representatives and their representatives on health and safety committees. So these are two very fundamental rights. And as Anna has mentioned, Convention 155, the Framework Convention on Health and Safety, and Convention 187, this is ILO Convention 187, the Promotional Framework Health and Safety, have now been made part of the fundamental principles and rights at work. And what this means that even where countries have not ratified those conventions, they have to take the principles and requirements of those conventions and put them into national legislation. So this is a very fundamental sort of step forward. And if we can capitalize on that development linked to the launch of the manuals or the guidelines and the manuals, then we can actually move the agenda forward in Latin America and the other parts of the world, in the banana industry. And I think it was Adela also mentioned pineapples or wherever we need to. Once you've done this basic, once you've got the basic risk assessment methodology, the basic approach, the idea of strengthening worker representative systems, but linked very strongly, closely with boosting the ability of management to handle these things. You can apply this to any sector. You can apply it to any other agricultural sector. You can apply it to actually any other economic sector. It's a basic tool that you can use across the board.
Indeed, thank you very, very much, Peter. I see that, yes, Javier Villesís had his hand raised. So I would like to give him the floor. Su micrófono ya está habilitado, así que solamente lo tiene que activar, por favor, señor Villesís. Sí, muchas gracias.
Listo, ahí me escuchan.
Sí, perfecto.
Gracias. Bueno, primero agradecer a ustedes por la invitación. De verdad que es muy interesante poder conversar estos temas entre todos los actores de la industria. Quería hacerle una pregunta a Peter, y coincidimos muchísimo en lo que se ha comentado. La responsabilidad es indelegable. La participación de los trabajadores en el diagnóstico de los riesgos es imprescindible también, ¿no? ¿Verdad? Yo no sé si Peter pudo consultar o revisar, todavía tiene la oportunidad, seguro que sí, pero quería su opinión, el Manual de Seguridad y Salud Ocupacional de la Industria Bananera en el Ecuador, que se trabajó justamente de la mano con el Foro Mundial Bananero, que ya es ley aquí en el Ecuador, en donde, por ejemplo, todos los meses hay un comité de salud y seguridad ocupacional, 3 miembros representantes de los trabajadores o sus sindicatos, 3 miembros de los empleadores para programar y desarrollar planes de acción y capacitación, porque aquí hay mucho de entrenamiento y capacitación a todos los trabajadores. Entonces quería dar la opinión de él respecto a este manual que, como digo, aquí en Ecuador es ley, está publicado por parte del Ministerio de Trabajo como una obligación de toda la industria bananera en el Ecuador. Nada más, y muchísimas gracias, de verdad.
I think there's, thanks for the question. I think there's recognition that the Ecuador, the FAO Ecuador manual will also be undergoing a process of revision, similar to the revision that we're already undertaking with the World Banana Forum, with a cooperation with IUF and Banana Link on the Ghana and Cameroon manuals, and we've linked that, as we said, this to putting in positive language in the other women's guidelines. There definitely was confusion on the role of the employer in some of the earlier publications. It's as simple as that. We've got to be honest about it. It was not clear. And I think it's very important to actually spell that out. We want to encourage cooperation. We want to encourage working together as much as possible, but you also have to sort this out in terms of, you have to be clear about legal responsibility. I think it's perfectly, it's good practice to get the workers working with employers, carrying out risk assessments, and more importantly, identifying the risk controls that you need to put in place to save, to save a life, to save a limb, to save a lung. But the employer then can't turn around and say, oh, well, actually, the risk assessment was carried out by a worker or an outside service, nothing to do with me. That's got to be clear. If you borrow someone's car or someone loans you the car, you can't, the original car insurance, the liability for the car insurance rests with the owner of the car, not the person driving it, if you want a simple analogy. But I think it's important we understand that. And what we've done, talking more broadly with parts 2 of the various manuals that we're dealing with, which were dedicated solely to workers in the original drafts, we've now made sure they are dedicated to employers and workers, because many of the duties in parts 2 of the manuals that were being identified as, the worker must do this, were in reality the actual duty of the employer. So I think we're clear on that, and I think there seems to be a growing consensus within the World Banana Forum, within the main meetings, and within Working Group 3 on labour conditions, that's the correct way to go. So I think we've righted the balance, and I think you're quite right that with the Ecuador manual we need to make sure that similar revisions are made.
Thank you, Peter. Solo para agregar también, señor Villasís, que como mencionó Víctor, la Secretaría del Foro Mundial Bananero actualmente está, el Foro Mundial Bananero está viendo la posibilidad de, también por interés de algunos actores en Ecuador, de actualizar el manual, porque obviamente es un manual que se desarrolló en 2014-2018, entre ese periodo, y hay también importantes aspectos que hay que incluir, como mencionó también Peter, pero también el tema, digamos, de después de la pandemia, el tema de R4T, la bioseguridad, o sea, hay muchos temas que hay interés de incluir también en el manual, así que se está viendo la posibilidad de iniciar un proceso para actualizar el manual, un proceso, digamos, multiactor, como se hizo en la primera fase también. Espero que eso le haya respuesto a la pregunta, señor Villasís, o si quiere comentar algo más.
No, estamos claros, Camila. Definitivamente sí hay una necesidad de actualizarlo, ¿no, verdad? En las industrias, como en todo ámbito, pues hay cambios, hay modificaciones, hay nuevas maneras de trabajar y todo debe ser actualizado y mejorado. Todo es susceptible de mejora. Definitivamente sí hay una oportunidad ahí. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchas gracias a usted, señor Villasís. Margarita, you have your hand raised. I will enable your microphone. So it's enabled. You just need to unmute yourself. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for this presentation and very interesting also the discussion. My question that I know that is goes beyond this manual, but is I would like to have a consideration from Peter, because it is one of the most relevant problem linked to the effectiveness of practices. It is regarding to the aspect of enforcement. So despite there are many international convention, legal liability and so on, but many countries, not only Latin America, but also, for instance, Europe, it is not easy, the enforcement of the law. So then my question, starting from your experience, is what can be done, because if we have good manuals, tools, and so on, and also legal framework, but at the end there is not, or because of corruption, or because weak institution, there is not enough capacity for enforcement of the legal framework. So the risk of ineffective not effective measure is very high. So just having in consideration from your side. Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, shall I pick that question up? I mean, I think the whole issue of enforcement and compliance is a central one. If you look at agriculture just generally, not just banana plantations, but agriculture as an industry around the world, agriculture, health and safety in agriculture has lagged behind improvements in other sectors. We still have 180,000, an estimated 180,000 fatalities every year. That means farmers and farm workers, men and women, who actually go out in the morning and will never return home. So we know there's a big thing to do. And when you come to enforcement and compliance, that's always a tricky area. We've got to be honest about this. And when we looked at some of the, as I said, I mentioned that I used to be a health and safety inspector working for the government in the UK. So I used to go to farms in the UK doing enforcement and compliance 4 days out of 5 every week. And what we've tried to do in terms of the manuals and guidelines is make sure that there are strong references to making sure that the managers and the workers are competent health and safety, they have relevant skills, they have relevant training. But we also have brought in the issue of government labour inspection. And this is where enforcement and compliance will be important. The conclusion of the International Labour Organization over many years, looking at agriculture around the world in terms of labour inspection, is that labour inspection in agriculture is either totally non-existent or so weak as to be ineffective. So one of the issues is how to build better labour inspection systems. And in terms of, for example, Ghana, we've made sure that they could join in some of the basic discussions. But it is an issue, and it's an issue you will have to think through. How do we ensure enforcement and compliance in the banana industry, in the banana sector? It's a weak area at the minute. How do we bring in, and I stress government labour inspection, because labour inspection is a government function. There's no such thing as private inspection. You can have private certification, you can have private auditing, you can have private monitoring, but inspection is a function of government. So we have to be very clear about how we strengthen that. So in terms of actually taking the guidelines forward and the related manuals, how do we make sure that the labour inspection services are part of what we're doing and can actually participate? Because at the end of the day, you're going to need, if you're going to ensure enforcement and compliance, you're going to need their participation. It's a difficult issue to get laws applied, and I think we should reflect on the recent comments of the ILO Director General, who's just retired, who said that many countries consciously and deliberately continue to exclude agricultural workers from protection under basic labour laws. So it's not just health and safety, but it's also all the other aspects. And women workers are particularly vulnerable in this respect. So there is a broader need to bring in a whole area of government into this process and see how we can strengthen it. But and we've been conscious of that. But that's the dialogue that needs to take place within the World Banana Forum of how we can do more on that area.
Indeed, thank you, Peter. I see that there's no other hands raised, and I think no additional comments in the questions. So yes, I don't know, Anna, if you would like to add anything else before Peter, before we bring the session to a close. Peter, I don't know if, we only have 4 minutes. I don't know if you would like to briefly kind of showcase how this risk assessment form would look like, or probably, yeah.
Let's do the COVID. We can do it in 4 minutes. We're super kids.
No, the objective would just be to show you what, based on the presentation that Peter gave, how this kind of risk assessment would look like. I think you can see it on the screen there. So it was
We-
just to give a brief overview of what this would look like, practically speaking. Yes, go ahead, Peter. You have the floor.
And you'll find you'll find a blank table on page 62 of the Latin American guidelines, and 61, sorry, and you'll find a work example relating to musculoskeletal disorders on page 62. But this is something we did very quickly in the Ghana risk assessment workshop, the FAO, the recent one we held. And you can see we just do step one. What are the hazards? Well, in this case, COVID-19. Who might be harmed? Well, quite an easy answer, like the world. And are we dealing with, low, medium, or high risk? I think there was a consensus that we're potentially dealing with a high risk situation. So what are you already doing about controlling COVID? And the point is that when you divide the control measure, the risk controls into two steps, step 3A, step 3B. And the message I would give to companies is that if they're doing things correctly, if they're doing things well, step 3A allows them to show that in terms of risk assessment. They can say, hey, we've already got this problem pretty well controlled. So in fact, we're dealing with a lower risk situation. And then in step 3B, you can identify, the companies can identify in cooperation with the workers if they need to do more. And so what we did, we said very quickly, elimination, substitution, not possible with COVID, obvious reasons, it's a pandemic. We said technical engineering control, risk control too. We said the vaccine technology was probably the sort of main technical fix that was being used, that was being brought in. Work organization, risk control 3 is very important. The whole business of social distances, barriers, the importance of sick pay. If you don't have sick pay systems in a country, this is broader than health and safety, but if you don't have sick pay systems, workers need the money, they need to feed themselves, they need to feed the families, they will go to work when they're sick with COVID. It would affect everyone else. And remember, if you get an infection in a place like a banana plantation or a meat factory, the whole neighboring community then has to close down. It's not just linked to the factory, it has much wider ramifications. And you need to link this with good information and training on prevention measures for COVID and the like. Obviously, you then need to link it to risk control 4, which is good hand washing, soap, hand sanitizer, disposable towels. So good hygiene, good washing facilities, critical when you're dealing with disease management, and especially a highly transmissible disease like COVID-19. I think, can we just go down, please? And then, of course, you then come to personal protective equipment. And I think we've all over the past couple of years, we've all become familiar with these types of things, even if we didn't actually use them before. But again, do you actually provide this as a mask to prevent COVID, or do you provide this? This, I don't know the level of protection because I've never seen any safety data sheet on this. This is estimated, this is a FFP2, a full fitting face piece 2, or the second best market mask on the market. This will give you 92% protection against COVID. That's the estimation. So if you can choose between this and that, you're going to choose this for good levels of protection. And if you're traveling on the trains in Italy, by the way, Camila, this is what you're required to wear, I believe. And then you could go, just quickly down to the last thing, the risk control 6. You can look at medical surveillance. Well, obviously the medical surveillance is the PCR, the antigen tests, the lateral flow test. One you can do at home, one you need to go to a chemist or a doctor's to get, to carry out and get the results. But there is our medical surveillance. So COVID is a perfect illustration of all the 5 steps of risk assessment as written in the heading, and more importantly, the 6 risk controls written in the order they need to be done, carried out. Elimination is not possible for the other measures, but you don't start dealing with COVID just by wearing a mask. There's a whole lot of other things you have to do first. I hope that's a very quick taking you through the issues. But that's the illustration. That's the value of doing things in a risk assessment format and doing it systematically. Train workers, train managers, train labor inspectors. We do a lot of training of labor inspectors on risk assessment because it's a very valuable technique. And it really will help boost health and safety in the industry. And it's something that's very easy to learn. And as Javier said, keep it simple. That's the main thing. Just keep it simple. It's not a complicated process. And workers, managers can easily learn it. And more importantly, they can actually go out and do something about the health and safety problems they face in their own workplaces. And that's the beauty of it.
Thank you, Peter. I see that we're getting close to already 6 o'clock. Solamente para mencionar, creo que era el señor Fausto Robalino, como dijo Peter también. O sea, aquí también puede ver un ejemplo de cómo esta metodología se puede simplificar. Obviamente se necesitan capacitaciones para los trabajadores y los empleadores para entender un poco más cómo funciona esta metodología, pero en esta página, por ejemplo, también pueden ver cómo se pone toda esta metodología en una, digamos, en una forma más práctica, donde los trabajadores, tanto como los empleadores, también pueden trabajar juntos para identificar estos diferentes pasos y colectivamente tratar de encontrar controles de riesgos, ¿no? Así que era solamente también para poder presentar esto, y como se hizo también unas capacitaciones en Ghana, también se intentó de usar este formulario para también abordar temas de género, específicamente de salud y seguridad en el trabajo, ¿no? Así que es un documento muy práctico que se puede usar en las plantaciones también. Como estamos llegando al final, me gustaría darle la palabra a Ana Cooper para dar algunas palabras y después vamos a concluir este seminario, pero muchas gracias a todos por todos los comentarios, las preguntas y las contribuciones que han sido muy digamos, bienvenidas y muy interesantes también las conversaciones mantenidas hoy. Ana, por favor, la palabra es suya.
Okay, thank you, Camila. No, I just wanted to say that, of course, the work that we've discussed today on occupational health and safety is just one part of the work that we're doing within the forum around gender. And yeah, I think there's a real need to understand the health and safety issues faced by women within the wider context of women's employment in the industry. Women remain a real minority in the workforce, and particularly in senior positions. And ensuring that the occupational health and safety risks are addressed for women is just one part of ensuring that the banana industry provides a woman-friendly environment. So yeah, some of the other major issues that we're looking into within the Gender Equity Task Force is that of sexual harassment, also that of employment discrimination, looking at the different roles done by women today and how we can maybe expand the employment opportunities, and also, of course, looking at women's wage rates and analysing the gender pay gaps. So yeah, just to say that please do look out for the various resources and information that we're producing on all of those different issues, and yeah, that we're following up on in the Gender Equity Task Force. So yeah, thanks to everyone for joining today. It's been a really excellent discussion at the end as well. So I think, yeah, we should definitely try and organise another discussion around the guidelines and these issues in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Just to close very quickly, I see it's 6:03 already, local time. So yes, again, on behalf of the Secretariat, we would also like to thank all of the participants today, but also most importantly, the panelists. So Anna, Adela, who unfortunately had to leave, and Peter, for all of your really important contributions in the session today, but also for the guidelines themselves. As you mentioned, Anna, this is just one piece of work that we're working on within the World Banana Forum. On gender, we have 5 different priority areas, many of them also kind of interlinked as well. So we have violence and harassment, health and safety, women's empowerment, and women's employment opportunities, along with the gender pay gap. So a lot of different fronts that we're trying to work on and address within the World Banana Forum. And I think that within the Banana Occupational Health and Safety Initiative of the World Banana Forum, this will be really an important resource to continue using in the future in countries that already have the project implemented, but also in future in other countries that we aim to be able to replicate this project both in Latin America and in Africa. So we hope that this will serve as really an important resource to be able to ensure that women's needs, the health and safety of women and specific risks, hazards and risks that they face are being addressed in these workplace risk assessments as well. So again, we would like to thank everyone for their participation today. Of course, if you have any other questions or comments, please feel free to contact the Secretariat, and we are happy to also forward these communications or questions to the panelists. We will be in touch again, hoping to have more news about the implementation of these guidelines in the forthcoming months in the short term. So yes, just to keep that on the radar within the World Banana Forum activities. So thank you all, and wishing you all a nice rest of the day. Thank you also to the interpreters and to the members of the Secretariat for all of their support.
And congratulations to everyone.
Yes, thank you very much. Wishing you all a nice day. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Anna.
Thanks, Camila.
Thank you, Mattia. And thank you, everyone from the Secretariat. Gracias a los intérpretes. Muchas gracias.
Okay, thank you.